artist humans, welcome to Art with Amira. Today we're going to be doing a card for Easter. We're going to do a watercolor painting of Easter eggs making a landscape. What? Yes, Easter eggs can become a landscape. We're going to use watercolor, wet on wet techniques. This should be a very short and fun and sweet little project. So enjoy making an Easter card and happy painting. Let's get started. Here are the supplies you'll need. You need watercolor paper folded to make a card, masking tape, a cup of water, pencil, eraser, watercolor set, paintbrush, I like a flat brush, and a color wheel to help you understand the color mixing that we're going to be doing today. You can do a color wheel by watching my watercolor color wheel tutorial. So first thing, when you fold your card, your watercolor paper, it's helpful to scrape your fingernail along the edge like that to get a really sharp, defined edge. Next thing I do is tape down my watercolor paper so that it doesn't buckle as I'm painting. You can use artist tape, or if you have regular masking tape, you can take the tape and lay it on a piece of fabric, like along your leg, to pick up a little bit of lint so that it doesn't stick so much to your paper and it doesn't tear when you take it off. I'm going to tape down all four sides. That'll keep the paper from buckling, and it'll also create a nice border when you're done containing all that messy watercolor. Okay, and the next thing you're going to do is to draw your egg landscape. Our landscape's going to have 3 layers of space: foreground, middle ground, and background. So I'm going to split the bottom into thirds to help me evenly space my eggs. The egg is just basically a curved V shape. Then I'm going to do a second layer between each egg, and that's called the middle ground, the middle layer. And then a third layer, the background layer of eggs. We're going to be using atmospheric perspective today to create the illusion of space. So what is atmospheric perspective? Atmospheric perspective is a technique that artists use, simulating what you see in nature in this photograph, where objects closer to the viewer or in the foreground are darker or more contrasted, have more saturated color and clearer edges, and then layers that go further into the background or further away from the viewer, or appear to be further from the viewer, are lighter, less saturated in color, and have softer, blurrier edges. This is a very useful technique in watercolor because it's easy to blur edges with a wet on wet painting technique, and that's what we'll be doing. So let's look at an artist who used atmospheric perspective in Japan. So if you look at this painting, Pine Trees by Hasegawa Tohaku, you can see the foreground trees are super clear and they get softer and blurrier as they move into the background. So in order to have your background layer fuzzier than your foreground, we're going to do a technique called wet on wet watercolor. So we're going to look at the last layer of eggs here, and we're going to paint right up to the middle layer of eggs, keeping that edge nice and clear. So I'm just using the corner of my brush, going right over those background eggs, and I'm trying to paint around the edge of the middle layer. Then I'm going to fill in the rest of the background with water, making sure not to go past my little line of water I created around the eggs. While I was zooming, it dried up a little bit, so I'm just going to reapply, not going past that middle ground layer of eggs. We don't want that layer to be as blurry as this background layer. Okay, so I've got it all nice and wet, and I'm going to look at my color wheel and decide on colors. So with atmospheric perspective, if you can gradate around the color wheel as you go from background to foreground, that'll push it even more. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my first layer of eggs, these couple of colors, my blues and blue greens. My second layer, I'm going to have greens and yellow greens. And then my foreground layer is going to be yellows and oranges. So that way we're gradually moving down the rainbow as we're doing our layers, and it'll really push kind of the foreground against the background. As you're doing a layer, you want to pick colors that are close together. Those are called analogous colors. They mix well, they blend well without making mud. We're not going across for each layer. So as you're working a layer, you're going to pick just a couple colors next to each other. Let that dry. The next layer, you're going to go to the next couple of colors. Let that dry, then go to the foreground colors. So you just want to jump around maybe 3 sets of colors on the color wheel. And as I was talking, this dried a little bit. So I'm going to keep this background layer wet. And I'm going to be working with my blues and blue greens. So I'm going to get a little water. You want to keep this very washy. Remember, with atmospheric perspective, your color is not very saturated. So you want a lot of water in with your color. That is too bright right there. So I'm really going to get a lot of water, maybe even get some more water here and make it super washy. So first I'm going to get a little blue in my sky. That's going to help build our atmospheric perspective as well. Having your background layer have a little bit of blue in it will also trick the eye into thinking that layer is further back. So I've got a little bit of blue for my sky, and then I'm going to create a simple pattern across these eggs and grab maybe just a little bit of yellow in my blue green and create a little pattern on this very last layer, and we want it very washy, so maybe this will be a little weird polka dot thing. You notice it's bleeding and making a very soft edge. That's what we want. If it bleeds too much, you can just pat it with your towel. Like, I feel like my greens got a little lost in there, so I'm just patting that a little bit. And we want it blurry, we want it to feel like it's going into the background. So these eggs are definitely dissolving away. Once they're dry, you'll go to the middle ground layer. If you get this layer wet right now, it's all just going to run together. So in watercolor, you kind of work in stages, areas that you're okay mixing together, then you let that dry before you get to another area where you don't want those colors to mix. So I'm just going to kind of make my sky a little more blue. Get a few more spots of color. Maybe I drop a little bit of blue in there to kind of make it feel like a little bit of a cloudy sky. Layers of clouds. Okay, it's kind of damp dry, not completely dry, which is fine for the technique we're doing. So I'm going to do my middle ground layer. I'm going to get those eggs wet. Being careful to control the edge. And you can kind of tilt your head to the side a little bit to help you see where the paper is wet. Get each egg wet of the middle ground layer. Checking my edges. And it's ready for the middle ground layer. So I'm going to go around the color wheel a little bit. Started with kind of blue greens, and now I'm going to go to green and yellow greens. So this beautiful thing happens with wet on wet where you get these little blooms. And I'm actually going to pat the paper just a little bit, not quite as wet as the layer behind it, because we want the middle ground to be a little bit clearer than the layer behind it. And try some strips. You can see it doesn't spread quite as much. It's just a teeny bit less wet than the other one. You want the middle ground layer to be a little bit brighter in color, like more saturated color than the layer behind it. That's part of atmospheric perspective, is more saturated colors give the illusion that they're in the foreground. So I could tell that my colors were going to dry a little bit washed out, so I'm adding a little bit more so that this layer is more saturated than the background layer. Gonna dry it, and then the foreground layer will have this colors coming around the color wheel up here. So yellow, oranges, red, oranges, like that. Actually, what I'm gonna do is draw a pattern on here, and then we're gonna work within those patterns to create some clarity in the foreground. Got my pattern ready, and now I'm going to work within this little pattern zone. So I'm going to start with polka dots and get just the dots wet. And I'm going to drop some red in there. And it'll stay right where you put the water, hopefully. And this is the foreground layer, so we want this pretty bright. So you're going to really load up each section with a lot of color. I'd like that to be more in the orange range, so I'm just going to drop a little bit of yellow in there, each one. Not going to go into the white area yet because that red is still wet. Once that's dry, I'll work in the area around the red. So I'm going to jump over here, kind of work in zones with watercolors. And actually, you don't have to wet the area. You can just paint within the area that you want to use. So I'm going to try a little, just straight orange. You can use the corner of a flat brush for precision and the flat area for larger areas. We want a lot of detail in the foreground layer. That's going to build the illusion that this is closer to the viewer. More detail the closer up. Just like if you zoomed with your camera, you'd see more if you zoomed in. So I'm going to get some red orange here maybe. Like a Charlie Brown egg. I feel like this egg is blending into that one, so I'm going to do some more darker color inside that yellow orange so it separates from that middle ground layer a little bit more. So feeling like that is blending into that one, so I'm going to darken that yellow orange here too. This one's still bugging me, so I'm going to just do a little more green so that it feels different from the foreground layer, since that layer was kind of blues and greens. So you can do a wash right over a layer that's already there once it's dry. Ooh, that mixed. That wasn't quite dry. At this point, you can add a little more detail to these ones back here, too, because you should see more detail on these than you see in the very furthest layer, where those eggs are almost disappearing now. Once your piece is dry, you're ready to take the tape off. So what I do, pull the furthest the edge closest to the art away from the art, and I pull at a right angle, and that means if your paper tears, it'll tear away from your art instead of ripping your art. Put that piece off, pull it away. And you have an Easter egg landscape using analogous colors in each layer, foreground, middle ground, background. As you go further back, the colors get less saturated, blurrier, and lighter, to the point that the last layer is almost disappearing into the sky. Hope you enjoyed making this Easter egg card. So I made 2. You can make a bunch. They go pretty quickly. So I have 2 kids too, so I'll give one to each kid. I would love to see your final paintings. You can go to my Art with Amira Facebook page and post photos. I would love to see your Easter egg art. Have a beautiful day, artist humans. Happy Easter!